What's the hardest thing about writing? Well, it's getting started. Maybe you're having a hard time coming up with a story idea, or you're stuck on where to take your story next. If you want a way into a story or a way through, I have 9 story starters to help you. This free PDF is full of story seeds and prompts to get you going. To download your 9 story starters, go to nancypanuccio.com/start. That's Nancy with an I, Panuccio with 2 C's, nancypanuccio.com/start. As you write, ask yourself, what is my character hiding? What truths are buried beneath his or her version of events? Because sometimes the most powerful part of a story isn't in what's said, it's in what's left out. Writer Unleashed is for you, a writer who has a story you want to bring onto the page and into the hearts and minds of readers. I'm Nancy Panuccio, writer, editor, and writing coach. And each week, we'll explore techniques, mindsets, and inspiration for writing stories readers can't put down. Thanks for spending some time with me today. Now let's begin. Today, we're delving into one of the most fascinating storytelling techniques, the unreliable narrator. Whether you're writing in first person or third, unreliable narrators can add layers of suspense, mystery, and unputdownable intrigue to your story. In this episode, we'll discuss why unreliable narrators are so compelling, 4 different types of unreliable narrators, and I'll share 4 tips to master writing an unreliable narrator. So let's get right to it. First, what is an unreliable narrator and why are they so irresistible? An unreliable narrator is either the first-person protagonist or perceiving subject of your story whose credibility is compromised, making their account of events potentially misleading, biased, or distorted. This unreliability can be due to intentional deception, self-delusion, limited knowledge, psychological instability, or personal bias. Here's why unreliable narrators keep your readers hooked into your story. When you have an unreliable narrator, readers are then compelled to interpret the story, looking for clues that reveal the truth beyond the narrator's perspective. And this keeps readers engaged and hooked into the story because they're implicated. They participate in the story, and the fun and thrill is in trying to fill in the missing pieces, to make inferences, and they read to find out if their inferences are correct. Okay, so let's move on to 4 different types of unreliable narrators. Number 1, the unintentionally unreliable narrator. This narrator's unreliability is not driven by a conscious desire to deceive, but by their limited understanding of the world around them. So there's misinterpretation and sometimes miscommunication. They may lack key information or misremember important details. They're not lying to us on purpose. They genuinely believe what they're saying. Their trauma, mental state, youth, or fears warp their perception of reality. And this makes their version of the story feel deeply personal, but not entirely trustworthy. For example, in Mark Haddon's novel, The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, Christopher, who has autism, narrates the story with a limited understanding of the social cues and emotions around him. So his perspective on events is skewed by his inability to perceive the world the way others do. In Suzanne Burney's novel, A Crime in the Neighborhood, 10-year-old Marcia is deeply affected by the murder of a local boy in her neighborhood. And this coincides with instability in her family life. Her father has just run off with her Aunt Ada. And in response, her mother starts flirting with the new next-door neighbor, Mr. Green. And 10-year-old Marcia houses a suspicion that Mr. Green committed the murder. So Marcia spends her free time observing Mr. Green's routine from her house. Her investigation soon begins to blur the line between objective event and imagination as she becomes more and more convinced of his culpability. So Marcia is quick to suspect that her new neighbor is involved in the crime. Her suspicions are fueled not by any real evidence, but by her deep-seated feelings of unease and her growing sense of isolation. Okay, unreliable narrator number 2, the self-deceiver. A self-deceiver is a narrator who's unaware of the falseness of his or her own account. They may deny or repress certain truths, convincing themselves of a reality that's not accurate. Their unreliability stems from personal bias, psychological blindness, self-delusion, or denial. These narrators are unreliable because they see the world through their own filter, one shaped by their desires, biases, and need to protect their self-image. For example, Nick Carraway in The Great Gatsby. At first glance, he seems like a neutral, reasonable observer. But as you read on, you start questioning how honest he really is. He idolizes Gatsby, downplays his own privilege, and subtly skews the story in ways that make you wonder, is he really as innocent as he claims? His bias shapes how we see Gatsby, making him both more tragic and more mysterious. Humbert Humbert in Lolita is a manipulative and self-justifying narrator who tries to make readers sympathize with his predatory behavior, distorting reality to suit his narrative, to suit his own self-image. He tries to convince us that his actions are justifiable, using poetic language and charm to manipulate us. But as the story unfolds, it becomes painfully clear that his narration is full of self-delusion and justification. And that contrast between his words and the horrifying reality is what makes the novel so disturbing and seductive. Okay, on to unreliable narrator number 3, the liar. These narrators straight up lie and manipulate us, whether it's for personal gain, survival, or just sheer malice. These characters control the narrative to suit their needs. For us, discovering the truth is part of the thrill of reading. A perfect example is Amy Dunn in the novel Gone Girl. She's the ultimate manipulator, feeding us one version of events before completely flipping the script. Her deception isn't just about shocking twists, it reveals how deeply calculating she is, how she weaponizes perception to frame her husband for her death. We learn how far she'll go to control the narrative. Her unreliability makes her character unforgettable. This novel is written in dual first person. Nick and Amy both manipulate their own narratives, and that's what makes this novel so compelling. Nick Dunn manipulates his side of the story by shaping his version of events in a way that presents him as more sympathetic, or at least less guilty than he might actually be. His manipulation is subtle at first, but becomes more pronounced as the story unfolds, leading to a shift in how we view him. Early in the novel, Nick frequently downplays his marriage's issues and his growing resentment toward Amy. He gives an impression of a loving, albeit slightly flawed husband who is caught up in a tragic situation. As the investigation into Amy's disappearance intensifies, he continues to manipulate his image by focusing on his concerns about his public perception and presenting himself as the good guy in an ugly situation. So he controls the narrative through half-truths. Nick often withholds important details or gives misleading accounts of events. He doesn't lie outright, but he does leave out key information, allowing the reader to form a different understanding of the situation than what's actually happening. This allows him to manipulate how readers perceive his actions and motivations. For example, Nick frequently emphasizes his confusion and shock during Amy's disappearance, focusing on how he doesn't know what's happening. And he doesn't in the beginning. However, as the novel progresses, we realize that Nick has been hiding significant parts of the truth, especially about his extramarital affair and his strained relationship with Amy. By omitting these details, he controls how we understand his character. Now, by alternating between Nick's perspective and Amy's, the author sets up a battle of narratives where each character tries to outwit the other in the minds of the reader. So this type of unreliable narrator shares only part of the truth or reveals key details at certain points in the story, keeping the reader in the dark until much later when the truth is revealed. And this creates suspense and intrigue as the reader must piece together the full picture from incomplete information. Another great example of this is the novel Big Little Lies. Throughout the novel, various characters offer their own perspectives on the events leading up to a murder, each character withholding crucial details. The unreliable nature of these narrators keeps the truth hidden until the final reveal. Okay, on to number 4. The narrator who rewrites the past. A great example of this kind of unreliable narrator is the novel Atonement by Ian McEwan. As a child, Brianny misinterprets an interaction between her sister Cecilia and Robbie, leading to a false accusation that sends Robbie to prison. As an adult, she later rewrites the past in an attempt at redemption. Now, Brianny is not simply an unreliable narrator because of her flawed judgment. Her unreliability also comes from her later attempt to atone for her mistake by rewriting the past. We don't know until the very end that both Robbie and Cecilia have died. So her unreliability isn't a deliberate attempt to deceive the reader. It stems from her youth, her guilt, and her complex motivations as an adult trying to atone for her actions. Okay, so we have the unintentionally unreliable narrator, we have the self-deceiver, the liar, and the narrator who rewrites the past. Okay, now let's move on to 4 tips for writing an unreliable narrator effectively. Number 1, drop subtle clues. These subtle clues allow the reader to slowly piece together that the narrator may not be fully trustworthy, creating a sense of growing tension. Inconsistent details in the narrator's description or memory of events plant seeds of doubt. These inconsistencies should be small enough to be brushed off at first, but as the narrative progresses, readers should begin to notice a pattern. For example, in Gone Girl, Amy's diary entries are filled with subtle inconsistencies. She tells the reader one thing in her journal, but the details of her actions don't line up with what's been described. Her memory of events shifts, making it clear that she's not as innocent as she presents herself to be. And these little shifts keep readers questioning her version of events. So you want to make sure the contradictions are incremental, gradually revealed, so readers aren't immediately clued in. You want to use the character's own perception of truth to reveal subtle distortions. Okay, on to tip number 2. Leverage contradictions. Let the narrator claim one thing while the events or other characters suggest another. If others respond skeptically or contradict your narrator's version of events, it signals that something is off. For example, in A Crime in the Neighborhood, Marcia observes events but has a distorted view of truth. Her statements about certain people and situations are frequently at odds with what is later revealed. As adults express doubts or contradict her understanding, we begin to see that her perception may not be reliable, but we do still wonder if Mr. Green is the murderer. So contradictions between the narrator's version of events and other characters' experiences create a sense of dissonance that draws attention to the narrator's unreliability. When a character's perception contradicts the actions of other characters or the facts presented, it often signals psychological defense mechanisms like denial, repression, self-deception, or even manipulation. Okay, on to tip number 3. Time the reveal strategically. Whether your narrator's unreliability is obvious from the start or revealed later, control the pacing of the revelation to maximize suspense. Unreliable narration doesn't have to be immediately obvious. It can be gradually revealed, which builds tension. By withholding the full truth until later in the story, you keep readers invested in discovering what's really going on. Suspense is often generated through delayed gratification. The longer you hold back key information, the more engaged your reader becomes, hungry for the truth. In effect, you're telling the reader, I didn't tell you everything, not yet. So delayed information can heighten suspense and make the reader eager for the full reveal. For example, in Shirley Jackson's We Have Always Lived in the Castle, the narrator, Maricat, presents a skewed, unreliable version of her family situation. At first, readers don't fully understand the depth of the family's tragedy, but as the story unfolds, more and more pieces of the truth are revealed, keeping the reader guessing until the final pages. So you want to decide when the narrator's unreliability will become clear to the reader. Do you want the reader to figure it out early, or do you want them to stay in the dark until a key revelation? So you want to use foreshadowing to keep the tension high. For example, a seemingly innocent statement at the start of the book might turn out to be a significant distortion revealed later. Okay, last one, tip number 4. Lean into subjectivity. You want to show how the character's emotions, biases, or experiences warp their understanding of reality. The most unreliable narrators aren't intentionally deceiving readers. They genuinely believe their own version of events. They're deceiving themselves. The more emotionally invested a narrator is in a situation, the more their bias will affect their interpretation of the world. Unreliable narrators often believe their own distortions, which makes them more mysterious and compelling because the reader begins to trust them. They're not lying, just trying to make it all make sense. Isn't that what we all do? The bottom line is this. The best unreliable narrators don't just distort the truth for the sake of distorting the truth. They reveal who they are through their distortions. Whether it's fear, trauma, or self-delusion, or lack of understanding, their unreliability forces us as readers to dig deeper, to go beyond the surface of the story and participate in what unravels. I think all narrators are unreliable to varying degrees. Certainly, first-person narrators are, because their understanding of their own situation or their own culpability in their situation is incomplete. If their knowledge is complete, then there's nothing pulling us into the story. There's nothing for us to discover. There's nothing for us to gaze towards. There's no questions tugging us further into the story. Now, for more on first-person narration, listen to last week's episode 221, Writing in First Person, 4 Common Pitfalls and How to Avoid Them. Episode 221, I'll link in the show notes. Okay, let's wrap this up. Unreliable narrators add depth, suspense, and complexity to a story by forcing readers to question what's real. We covered 4 main types of unreliable narrators. Number 1, the unintentionally unreliable narrator. Their limited understanding or perception skews the truth. Number 2, the self-deceiver. They genuinely believe their distorted version of reality. These narrators are deluding themselves. Number 3, the liar. They manipulate the truth for self-survival. And number 4, the narrator who rewrites the past. They reshape events to cope with guilt, regret, or denial. When writing an unreliable narrator, remember to, number 1, drop subtle clues to plant doubt. Number 2, leverage contradictions between what the narrator says and what's actually happening. Number 3, time the reveal strategically to keep readers curious, hungry, and engaged. And number 4, lean into subjectivity, showing how emotion, bias, and perception shape your character's reality. Ultimately, unreliable narrators aren't just about deception. They reflect the way we all see the world through our own personal lens. We misunderstand. We misinterpret all the time. And sometimes we rewrite our own stories to make sense of them. So as you write, ask yourself, what is my character hiding? What truths are buried beneath his or her version of events? Because sometimes the most powerful part of a story isn't in what's said, it's in what's left out. We're all unreliable narrators, so tap into the ways we get things wrong. I love this quote by Philip Roth from his novel, The Human Stain. The fact remains that getting people right is not what living is all about anyway. It's getting them wrong that is living. Getting them wrong and wrong and wrong, and then, on careful reconsideration, getting them wrong again. That's how we know we are alive. We're wrong. So we get people wrong. We misinterpret the world around us. It's the most human thing we do. Misunderstanding others and misinterpreting events is an inherent part of the human experience. We all make assumptions about others, some of which are based on incomplete information or our own biases. And those misjudgments are a natural part of our interactions with the world around us. And unreliable narrators are shaped by their own misunderstandings, whether intentional or unintentional. Their version of reality might be incomplete, and readers can only see the truth as it slowly unravels. So there you have it. Thanks for hanging out with me today. And if you know any writers who need some support in their writing, please share this episode or the Writer Unleashed podcast in general. And if you love what you're listening to, subscribe on your favorite listening platform and please leave me a review. Reading how this podcast impacts your writing truly lights me up and helps me create topics for the show. Till next time, keep writing, and I'll talk to you soon.